Hi, welcome. I'm Dr. Bob Sawvelle, and I'll be your instructor for Evangelism and Discipleship in Small Groups, course number 5083 with the Global Awakening Theological Seminary, otherwise known as GATS. And so excited to be your instructor. I'm just finishing up teaching the Evangelism course with GATS, course number 5073. So if you happen to be in that class, you'll notice that there is just a slight overlap. We'll be using Dr. Robert Coleman's book, The Master Plan of Evangelism. That's a classic on evangelism. We'll just be using the first three chapters in particular because Coleman really gets into the purpose of the Great Commission, which was not just to make converts, but to make disciples. And so he really starts out the book, and his whole thesis for evangelism, that it's about making followers of Christ, making disciples of Christ, and how Jesus chose individuals that he could pour into, that he could train, that he mentored, that he was in a very close relationship with. It was a discipleship relationship, and as true to nature for rabbis at that time, disciples would be an exact replica of their teacher in both word and deed. So the gospel of the kingdom is extremely important, as it includes not only the message of being freed from our sins, or what we would call the gospel of salvation, but it also encompasses the whole person. The gospel of the kingdom is God's rule, and one of the first lessons you'll be watching is a sermon I did earlier this year titled The Gospel of the Kingdom, where I really break down what the gospel of the kingdom is. And so that's a bedrock for discipleship and the model that Jesus used, because he was trying to train disciples in understanding God's rulership on earth as it is in heaven, but that included more than just teaching and preaching. The expectation was the proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom would also bring a demonstration of healing, deliverance, signs, and wonders. All of these were aspects of what Jesus was imparting to those early disciples, and what he expected to be replicated throughout the ages with other disciples. So at the heart of discipleship then is really understanding what Jesus intended and how he intended that model to be replicated. Now, two other books that you'll be reading very closely is a book by the late Dr. Dallas Willard. The title is The Great Omission. It is an outstanding book. Dallas was a professor of Christian philosophy, and I believe at the University of Southern California for well over 40 years. And in the 1960s, he was an assistant Baptist pastor at a church, and God began to speak to him about influencing in the universities. And essentially, if you want to have influence in the universities, you need to be in the university. So he eventually resigned and left pastoring, got his PhD, began to teach in universities, eventually was picked up there at USC, and spent most of his career in his life ministering and teaching out of USC. He was a widely respected and known professor, not only at USC, but teacher around the country, would do seminars on discipleship and the role of grace in discipleship in particular. His writings, I believe, were just stellar. And so you'll notice that through the course, I rely heavily on his book to really make us think about what genuine discipleship is, and how, sadly, again, in the early chapters, he outlines this, how we've lost the aspect of the Great Commission of making disciples in all the nations. And so he explains what that great mission is, and then he lays out his thesis throughout the book on how we can come back to a more of a biblical model of discipleship. The third book that you'll really be reading closely is called The Class Meeting by Kevin Watson, I believe. And Watson also is a PhD. He is a Methodist and has looked closely at John Wesley and the early Methodist movement in the 18th century, and why they were not only so successful in that initial revival, but why that revival was sustained. And his belief and thesis, it had to do with the class meeting, the early Wesleyan model of class meeting, where they'd have small groups and discipleship accountability. And so I'm going to rely heavily on that book as well to help us really think what small groups are. And Watson believes that there's a lot of curriculum-based type of discipleship programs in many of our churches, which is different than a transformational-based model of discipleship, which is more interested in not disciples just learning more information, but in disciples having their hearts changed to become more like Jesus Christ. And so he is a very excellent book. And again, he relies heavily on the early Methodist tradition in the early parts of the book to explain why he's come to the conclusion that looking at some aspect of that model would be relevant for our time. And then he begins in the latter part of the book to lay out a proposed model for doing a small group discipleship class that would really focus on transformation of the individual to be more like Christ. So those will be the main texts that we'll be using. Again, the first two messages, they're from two of my Sunday sermons in my church. Again, the first one is on the gospel of the kingdom. The next one is I started the study of the book of Mark right after I taught on the kingdom in May of this year. It's the study of the book of Mark part 2. And in that, you'll see that in the early chapter 1 of Mark, in the early writing of Mark, we really take a look at the calling of those first 4 fishermen and what it really means to be a disciple. So I think was a very good message, and I think it would really be beneficial for all of you to see that. Then I'll be teaching 6 other lessons, which will be in a more casual format. Those lessons will be geared more just for this class, where I'll be looking at some of the reading that you'll be doing, as well as interspersing some of my thoughts, as well as interspersing thoughts between Willard's book, The Great Omission, and Watson's book, The Class Meeting. Some of those lessons, I'll have some overlap of those chapters each week that you'll be leading. And I'm trying to thread something together here where Willard takes more of a philosophical view of what real discipleship should be and sort of an overarching view of that. And Watson gets more into the nitty-gritty, especially in the back of his book, the latter part of the book, on how to actually do a class meeting. So I kind of want to intertwine those thoughts. And you'll notice, based on some of those teachings, as well as some of the questions that I pose, I'm going to really get you to think about discipleship and what it really means, coming back to a biblical understanding of it, as well as how do we really practically do that today. For example, in Wesley's time, in the 18th century, one of the hallmarks of the class meeting was when the members were there, and again, they were small in number, right? Usually 12 or less people. Wesley, one of the questions he would have the class leaders ask those participants is, how is it with your soul? In other words, in our vernacular, it would be something like, how's your spiritual walk? How are you doing this week? And that was the main focus of the class meeting. Now, in our culture, in our time, getting people to be that committed to a group where they faithfully attend, where they're being somewhat vulnerable with not only the leader but one another in the group, to really tell each other how they're doing. In our 21st century culture, that could be frightening for many people in our churches. Yet I believe Watson raises a very good point throughout this book. It causes us to think. In most of our churches, and my church is no different, many of the small groups that we've done in the past have been more information driven or curriculum based. And while they may be good, do they really get to the hard issues of how people are doing? Are they really helping people grow more in the likeness of Christ? How accountable are people that are just sitting in a small group discussion about, let's say, learning how to use your spiritual gifts, or learning how to function in healing, or the gifts of the Spirit, or whatever it may be. Or it could even be a financial class or a marriage class. All of those are good and needed. But when it comes to real discipleship at a close-knit, heart-to-heart level, like we see with Jesus and those early disciples, or we see with Wesley and the early Methodists and how they approach discipleship. I think in many of our 21st century churches and North American culture, we come up a little bit short. So part of what I'm aiming at with this class and the direction I'm going is to get all of us to think more about it. How do we develop practical discipleship models that help people become more like Christ, yet understand the nature of our culture, the busy schedules that people have, the lack of continuity sometimes that people have in terms of committing to a class and being there every week for a few weeks, all of these kind of factors. So we're going to kind of experience that together. My hope is, because I know many of you are heavily involved already in ministry or will be, some of you are already pastors, some of you will be pastors, and this is a very key element of, if not the essential element of what Jesus left us with in Matthew 28, 18 through 20, where he says, all authority has been given to me. I give unto you. You therefore go and make disciples of all the nations. And so that was some of the parting words that Jesus left those early disciples, and through the generations have left with us. And so the question is, how do we make disciples who are genuine followers of Christ, not just people who are learning information in our churches, not just people who are attending occasionally our churches, but how do we help people have transformative encounters with God, with Jesus, with the Holy Spirit, and really become on fire Christians who are able to not only evangelize, but then help effectively disciple others. And that is the essential element of the church, and has been for 2,000 years. So that's the direction I'm going with in the course. I think it's a very important course. I'm excited about it. I hope that you will too. Again, I'm going to make you think on some of the questions that I've asked. If you were in my evangelism class 5073, that was more of a hands-on, how to do evangelism, prophetic evangelism, words of knowledge, kind of getting out there and, as Wimber used to say, doing the stuff, so it was more hands-on. I didn't go as deep on some of the questions and things to get people comfortable with evangelism and going that direction. But now I'm going to take it to another level where we're going to think more about what real discipleship is and how do we come up with practical models, discipleship models that are relevant for our time and in our churches. So again, welcome to the class. Some housekeeping notes. It's best if you can try to reach me if you're going to be late on assignment, obviously before that assignment is due. By email would be your first way. Use my bob@passiontucson.org. It's in the syllabus. That email, it comes right to my phone. I see that almost like a text. And so I get those emails, check them frequently throughout the day. My email address through the university, I'm teaching in 3 different places, 2 different seminaries, as well as with Global Awakening through the CHCP program. And so sometimes I don't see some of the emails if you send it through the GATS email system. I may not see it for a day or 2. So if you want to get a hold of me right away if it's something urgent, that is a good way. Or text me. My cell phone is a great way. Again, that's in the syllabus. You can go ahead and text me in that manner, and that's a good way to get a hold of me as well. So again, welcome to the class. Try to keep up with your work, stay ahead of it, and again, let's journey on this together as we think through what it really means to be a genuine disciple of Jesus Christ, and how can we help make disciples for the next generation and that generation beyond. God bless.